Hello, folks. Here's part two of our World War One lecture series from the bunker here at Mr. Lawyer's house again. Not really a bunker, more like a bedroom in the basement where no one will find me and bother me for a few minutes, as we are currently running a high school AP program, a middle school, and an elementary school in our kitchen. So, when I last left you, we had gotten ourselves into a real mess called World War One. Hopefully, you've watched the video I gave you that shows Princep and his ham sandwich and how he started the war, and you have listened to my my wonderful voice. Yeah, right. Of what got us into this. I've also put the drawing up. I'm sorry, it's probably tilted the wrong way, but this technology thing's a little new. All right. So, moving forwards, here we have actually started a war, and now we are going to fight it. So here's what happens: the plan to fight the French was called the Schefflin Plan, named after the general who came up with it, and that was where we left. We had invaded Belgium, and what would have been a brilliant move to sweep in, as you can tell by the lovely picture. However, the Belgians slowed them down. The taxi cabs got the forces there, and the Russians actually started fighting, which, when we talk about the Russian front, that's kind of, well, unusual. So, and of course, British forces will then arrive very quickly and shore this up. So, what thought to be a short little war is not going to be a short little war. Now, there are several battles. Like we said, this is the Battle of the Marne, where German forces came literally within sight of Paris. They could see Paris, but that's that whole taxi cab thing I was talking about. Now, this is the part that's really kind of disturbing about this war, is that it's happening so quickly that people are excited about going to war. People are going to go march off when this starts going to UMPA bands in the German and Austrian states. In England, you're going to have entire divisions brought up in what would be POW brigades, where every young man in a town are going to sign up together. So they thought this was going to be a glorious little war. To kind of give you a kind of point of reference, it'd be kind of like what happened with U.S. forces and Confederate forces at the beginning of the Civil War, at the Battle of Bull Run, the very first one, when they were picking flowers and eating berries, and people brought picnic lunches. And then they determined that this is not going to be a splendid little war, and that we aren't in for like something normal, what they saw. So, what you're going to see is, because of the technology development of what we call no man's land and trench warfare, these trenches are going to stretch, like it says, from the North Sea to the Swiss border. These are hellholes. They are going to put in stepped up areas where you can be able to fire and not expose yourself. They typically have a wood bottom, like they take pallets or create wood sidewalks almost to allow, but these things are going to fill with blood and gore and water. This is where the term trench foot comes from, because if you dig in the ground, water tends to go where the ground is the lowest, and the trench bottom is the lowest. And so soldiers that were exposed to this water for a long period of times, it actually would start rotting their feet away because of all the bacteria that's on your feet. When they're exposed to water, it makes that tissue softer and your feet start to rot, which is basically trench foot. So, as the bacteria attacks it. So, yeah, that's where that term comes from. I know, as we are in the middle of a global pandemic, talking about bacteria and things is probably not cool, but hey, it is what it is. So some of these trenches, though, were a little bit more sophisticated than others. Like, obviously, the ones in the rear areas, they actually found bowling alleys, pianos, women's lingerie, because some of the generals actually brought their mistresses up to the front. Now, those are actually a little ways from. So basically, a trench warfare, there are different levels of trenches. And the area in between is obviously no man's land. So the forward trenches is where most of the fighting would happen. And then you would move back to the secondary trenches, where they keep troops, like the Germans would keep their forces called stormtroopers. And I know you're thinking Star Wars, but that's not the kind of stormtrooper we're talking about. These actually can hit their targets. And so these are usually the elite, more veteran forces that have been trained, and they're usually either used for mop up, or rear guard if the trenches in the forward parts are broken. And then obviously the rear trenches were where command staff, HQs, and things like that were, and obviously hospitals. And then farther back away from the trenches, you'd find hospitals and rear guard areas and resupply areas and artillery. Okay. So between the areas, some new things developed also. Like from the United States came a thing called barbed wire. It's really good for keeping cows out of corn in Oklahoma, as we talked about how the enclosure movement affected America. And then we talked about enclosure movement in Europe, where they built stone fences in England and hedge lines in France. Well, in America, that guy in DeKalb, Giddens, he basically came up with a thing called barbed wire. Works really good at cows, but it also works good at stopping human beings or slowing them down during a charge. And so you're going to see barbed wire used, landmines, artillery like you never seen before, and of course, eventually poison gas. And if you can get through all of that, there's still the guy firing 30 millimeter rounds at you from a machine gun that's probably going to ruin your chances of getting to the other side. Hence why they call this no man's land, and why these trenches are going to move very, 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 very little. So, and this is an example of what a trench will look like. You can see where the berm is, where you can climb up. Typically what happened is you and your other men would be in your trench, and then some young lieutenant would blow a whistle, and then you'd pop your head over, and then you'd end up climbing out of that trench, and you're going to have to run again across possibly 100 yards of death and destruction as artillery's reap through it. And then there's machine gun fire just mowing you down. At one point during battles, you're actually see the Germans are going to stop firing because it's just not sporting anymore. And you're also going to see eventually the idea of poison gas, because you just can't break these lines. So, and here you can see example of the trenches, and of course the machine guns that would just mow these men down. You can also see that the machine gun crew is also using gas masks. So that shows another one of those poison gas attacks. So here's some more examples, the dugouts. And then you see these are Americans in the trench over here who were wearing their gas masks. Now, gas masks, the very first unit that's going to be gassed is a Canadian unit, and they really didn't know what they got themselves into. And some of these gas masks are inactive charcoal, which means they have to be started with some type of ammonia. There was a French gas mask that had to do that, which means you had to urinate on the gas mask. So imagine in the middle of a poison gas attack, and you have to pee on your gas mask. Poison gas attacks even were bad enough that they used horses had gas masks. So, yeah, it's real. So now today, because of mobility, this is one of the things we'll talk about later again, that trench warfare really isn't a thing in most modern warfare. Now, notice I say most modern warfare, because the next war, the technology and capability of weapon systems like the tank and the airplane make it so that digging a trench just makes it easier to bury you. Like in the second Gulf War, Iraqis actually tried to dig trenches, and then we hit them with cluster bombs, which buried them after we blew up the trenches. Now, on the other hand, technology can also slow down warfare. For example, what's happening in the Ukraine? Ukrainians actually are fighting a trench warfare against pro-Russian nationalistic forces in Ukraine, because the United States and the Russians have supplied so many sophisticated weapons that it makes tanks almost useless with the rocket systems, and it also suppresses air power. So, yeah, I don't know what to tell you. Sometimes you get trench warfare and sometimes you can't, but I don't think you want it in general either way. So some of the battles that you need to know about that may show up on the AP test: Battle of Verdun, which is the Germans wanted to basically just punish the French. You're going to see French losses of, like it says on the slide, 540,000, and the Germans are going to lose 430. And now the part of this, now granted, the numbers are going to be extremely high in the Battle of D-Day or in the sieges of Stalingrad and Leningrad. These are going to be huge numbers, but these are just over a few days. And in some cases, these young men are being sent out and entire villages are being wiped out. Every boy that you've ever known is being wiped out because basically the strategy was that as long as I've got men, I can send them into the fray and I'll just keep throwing men at them. The problem is that we hadn't learned yet. It's like what we learned in US history that the Civil War, they started using Napoleonic tactics, but because the technology had changed and the weapons capability had changed, that the strategies had to change. Hence why Grant is more and Sherman are more effective when they fight what we call total war. People before this had fought limited war. This is pretty much the first total war in European history, and they just haven't caught up yet. And the massive death tolls, they're telling boys at the Battle of the Somme, as they do 24 hours of shelling, that don't worry, boys, there won't be anybody there. We'll just walk over and we'll take their trenches. Well, if you're alive in your trench and they're shelling you, then logic would dictate that they're alive in their trench. Well, that didn't stop them from blowing the whistles and sending 420,000 British forces across no man's land and killing. The Germans are going to kill so many of them that they're going to stop shooting at some points. So this was a failure of catching up with technology and strategy. And the British would just stiff upper lip it and then send men like meat into a grinder because that was the strategy they had. So, and this is an excerpt from All Quiet on the Western Front that shows this trench warfare. I posted these slides online. You can read it, and so you can get a better idea of what it looks like, and you can get a better feel of what's happening. This is what, if you've read and done your homework yet, those two poems I posted on Flanders Fields and Disabled, this is what's going to cause what we call the lost generation. You're going to see the term shell shock being thrown around. There's no counseling really, and it's in its rudimentary ideas of psychology, as we're going to see later with Freud. And these men are coming back maimed and scarred physically, and some coming back with wounds that can't be seen. Tolkien had for a long time rejected the idea that the story of Lord of the Rings is about him in some way, but he suffered from all his friends being killed in a shell attack. Well, he left it. And so there are a lot of correlations between him and Bilbo Baggins, and the fact that he can't go home. So there is a lot of this lost generation concept, and you're going to see men that just don't fit into society anymore, that they can't hold jobs. They feel like society has lost them. Some of them are going to turn to drink. Some are going to commit suicide. Some of them are going to be very angry, and they're going to drift towards things like Nazism and nationalism, especially with what's coming with the Cold War. And this year, industrialization. The Zeppelin was used for spotting, and they did try to do bombing, but since these things are filled with hydrogen, not highly sophisticated and not very workable in the concepts. The U-boat probably was the most effective weapon during this war, and the machine gun, because the massive death tolls the machine guns could cause. And of course, the U-boat is going to help, because this is why all those battleships, and I highly recommend, if you got Disney Plus, they have a Drain the Sea thing for World War I, and you can see the Battle of Jutland, which is this massive battleship battle that takes place between the Germans and the British. And so if you've got Disney Plus, look that up. It's Drain the Seas, World War I. Well, the U-boats have to come out because the Germans basically can't break out of the Baltic. They can't get out there. And of course, the British can have these massive supply lines coming from all their colonies. And so that's what's slowing down the German war effort. They can't beat the British. Well, the U-boats and unrestricted submarine warfare allows them to attack all these supplies that are coming in and troop movements. So the U-boats are really effective. However, the same effective weapon is what's going to cause the Americans to enter the war. The tank that you see in the picture, well, they only go about 8 miles an hour, but they're not meant to go fast. They're meant to chew through that barbed wire we talked about earlier and get your forces over the hump and into the enemy trench. That will be now that same technology that was only meant to get you over the hump and through the barbed wire is the same thing that's going to turn trench warfare into a thing theoretically of the past, because the tank, this war that goes 8 miles an hour and is actually more dangerous to the people inside the tank than outside the tank, is going to be replaced by the German Panzer, which can run about 30 miles an hour. It can't shoot very well on the move, but it's got thick armor, and you can only hit it from the rear, and it's going to turn into what we call blitzkrieg, these fast-moving vehicles like armored personnel carriers, tanks, and airplanes. And they're going to move warfare faster to the point where, like today, the M1 Abrams tank can run about 50 miles an hour, can fire a spent uranium shell while on the run. And I believe it has cup holders and Sirius radio. I'm not sure about the Sirius radio. Don't hold me to that one, but you get the idea. And the airplane obviously is going to increase the devastation of warfare. And this one, they were start out as spotters, but then it turns into dogfighting. You're going to see some heroes come out of this. In the case of the Americans, it's Eddie Rickenbacker, who becomes the first American war ace. On the German side, it's Baron Richthofen, who even when he's shot down, which we now believe it was not shot down by another pilot, that he possibly been shot down from a Canadian unit shooting up at him, was given a hero's burial when he was shot down by the enemy. The Allies actually gave him a hero's funeral. Now, the airplane during this one that moved from spotting to aerial combat, they are going to see some bombing. They are going to try to bomb London, which is somewhat effective, I guess. And you're going to see some attempts to bomb Paris. It's not highly effective during this war, but obviously in the next war, you're going to see strategic air bombing, and you're going to see the Blitz and the bombing of Dresden, and of course the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so air power also is going to increase the mobility in warfare, which means trench warfare is gone. But the biggest thing the airplane's going to bring to this is that in the next war, you're going to see the airplane that's made out of balsa wood during this war and is mostly shot at trenches turns into an anti-civilian target and expands this idea of total war, because now civilians are going to be the target, and they're going to bomb cities and kill civilians in the next war. So, and now one thing we do need to talk about that could show up on the AP test is that you have your very first modern genocide. What happened is the Turks were moving Armenians who were anti-Turkish and had been for years, and there was fear by the Turks that the Armenians would support the war effort against the Turks, and so they were being relocated. And then in the process of this, that millions are going to be killed either through starvation or disease or direct slaughter by Armenian forces. Now, the reason this is kind of controversial is still today that the Armenians still enforce the idea that this happened. And the world sees this as it happened. However, the Turks still deny this happened. And so this is a major divide. And it's the beginning of this kind of, and you can see by the numbers of the populations that wherever their math is, the Turks, it ain't correct. So now on the Eastern Front, it's a little bit like not going well. You're going to see an attempt by British forces to take out the Ottoman Empire that is going to fail in what they call the Gallipoli campaign. This is also going to cause a young naval secretary to possibly seek to resign his position in the ministry. His name was Winston Churchill. You might recognize that name for the next war. You're also going to see this massive invasion of the Russians, who during this time are not very well equipped. In many cases, Russian soldiers would actually attend their own funerals before going to the Eastern Front. Soldiers were handed handfuls of bullets while the man next to him was handed a rifle. And then they go, well, why do I have a rifle? And he goes, when that guy dies, you'll have a rifle. Men charged at machine gun emplacements with pitchforks. Food was scarce, clothing even more scarce, and so the Russians are on the verge of a military collapse. Now, there are more things we'll talk about in the next and in one of the future lectures on the Russian Revolution that will explain why they are going to be forced out. Once the Russian Revolution takes place in 1917, the Russians are going to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is going to cause the Germans to drop out of the war and to lose about a quarter of their territory. So, and also on the Eastern Front, one part that does seem to work well theoretically is this nice man called, notice he's not really a nice man. I just using a euphemism there. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia is going to basically organize the Bedouin tribes to rise up against the Turks in the Middle East, with the promises that eventually they're going to be given independence and rule over their own territories. And the British says, pinky swear this is going to happen. As we know, pinky swear from the British doesn't actually work that way. For you as the United States, well, guess what? This slide should look very, very familiar, because this is what you learned last year in U.S. history, that because of the Germans trying to restrict the trade and the capability of the British forces and not being able to do it in battleship battles with them, they have to resort to unrestricted submarine warfare and using their lovely, lovely U-boats, which are not yellow, but they are submarines. They are going to go after the British hardcore, but the problem is their technology is a little lacking. Sonar's can't identify other than there's a ship there, and they're just basically a dude staring through a periscope, and he can't tell the difference between a battleship and a passenger liner, and that's what caused the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which will kill 128 Americans. Now, the question greatly is, did the Lusitania actually carry armaments, which the Americans were shipping armaments on board passenger liners? That is the truth. Well, we don't know, okay, because what happened is Bob Ballard, the guy that found the Titanic, well, he actually went and dove. You can actually dive to the Lusitania. You'll have to have a special suit, and you pretty much have to be a very, very expert diver to do this. Well, they dove the Lusitania using the technology they had from finding the Titanic. The problem is that when the ship sank, it landed on where the torpedo hit. And if the blast had moved the metal outward, it would be a sign that the ship was carrying ammunition, because the secondary explosion would have blown the hull outward. But since it's on there, you can't tell, and we'll never know. So you got that going for you. But America is still staying out of this one. And, well, sort of. Well, Operation Archangel, well, you're sort of, once the war happens, you kind of want your weapons back, and you kind of throw in support of the white Russians, which are the ones who are trying to maintain control over Russia for the non-Soviet forces. So you are going to see the use of American forces that are going to be deployed in Russia to get back our equipment, but in actuality shore up the government that was there before the Bolsheviks, which was a socialist nationalist government, like a democratic socialist government. And that's just going to make the Russian Revolution go even longer than it probably should have. You're going to see total war. We got to turn the masses of the population against and make everybody evil and paint them this way, like you see in this one. They're the Huns. You're going to see massive censorship. They're going to push our side. God's on our side, and God hates them. You're going to see the over exaggerations that we'll see again in World War II against the Japanese and the United States. That's what you're going to see here. Here's a couple examples. This one is from America, as an American poster, basically a brute, like an animal, a savage. Here is a German poster portraying the British as a poisonous spider who has spinned her web throughout Europe. This is a French poster here displaying how the Germans are even killing the angels and babies, I guess, with babies with wings. Well, angels, I think that's what they're going for. So it's very much the idea of painting the enemy as the enemy. Some other examples. This one basically is asking, it's a British poster of what did you, the children are asking, what did you do in the war, implying that you need to go sign up. You can obviously see that this one is pushing what's going to happen after World War II with the Zionist idea of creating a homeland for Jews, which is being pushed by many people because of the anti-Semitism that's growing in Europe. And of course, the Red Cross. So, and then here's some more. Now, women, only country in Europe that's going to allow women to openly serve and openly fight are the Russians. All the other women were in reserve positions. They weren't actually soldiers. And you're not going to see women deployed in large numbers with actual rank and position until World War II. But the Russians are way ahead of the curve, and women are actually going to serve in combat. So, as far as economics, we're going to see that there's a bit of an abandonment of that whole free market capitalism as they basically take over, the government does, the means of production to keep the war effort going. Labor unions, like you saw in U.S. history, are going to be basically put out. Many of them are going to support the efforts, but excuse me, there are going to be some strikes and that happen, but basically labor unions work with the government or they're going to see some major problems. There is going to be a cutoff of some supplies. You're going to see rationing in the war effort and you're going to see like women, like we said, are going to replace men like we saw in Europe. The Russians will allow women to serve in combat. You are going to see, and this is one of the things that's going to really change the system. Now, many of these people aren't going to be going into work and then staying there. You're going to see them get replaced by men. But in Europe, because of the massive casualties, some of those women are going to stay in those factories. It's going to create, like it says in the slide, create greater social equality, blurring those lines. You're going to give women, as we said before, they've already given women an education. Now you're giving them work, which gives them economic power. In 1919, after the war, you're going to give women the right to vote because they have economic power, and especially in these middle class. That's the thing. These are women that are middle class that are going to work, not the really, really poor. These are the middle class moms, daughters that are going to work, which is going to do a lot both to help them economically and politically. The France basically is under martial law. It's a duly elected dictatorship, as you kind of call it, with Clemenceau in power. And then here's the thing. Here's the thing that kicks us in is that Italy's going to flip sides because they, obviously they got a chance to gain something. And then the Zimmerman note is that part I hinted in the last video that and the story goes that the Germans were reaching out to the Mexican government that if the war happened and America declared war on Germany, that if Mexico were to aid the Germans against the American war effort, that they would then turn over at the end of the war and the victory against the United States territory for their actions that we had taken in previous wars, like the Mexican War. Well, okay, and it was found in a trash can at the in Mexico in the German embassy by British spies. But I'd like to point out that the British were not doing so well during this time period in the war effort. So take that as you may, that there might have been a little James Bond action happening here. But of course, that's what's going to trip the trigger in the United States at that point, threatening by an invasion by Mexico. Well, we got to go to war now, even though this is not going to be a popular war. The Balfour Note, well, that was the promise of autonomy that was going to be given to these Arab states if they rose up and aided us in our war actions. Well, you know what I said about a British pinky swear? I don't know if I'd count that as it's going to happen. And of course, Woodrow Wilson, you've seen this before. Woodrow Wilson's ideas of 14 points and his plan to end the war with liberal democracy lines and abolish secret treaties and freedom of the seas and all the self-determination. We're going to talk more about this when we finish up this war. So we'll come back to this one. Well, you enter the war, the United States does. You're all plucky. Lord knows you don't even have helmets. You have to borrow them from the British. And the problem is, and you don't even send your good guns, like the Browning machine gun, we did not even send there because we're afraid that the Allies might get a hold of it, take it apart, and figure out weapons technology. So we borrowed these crappy guns called Shawshank machine guns, which barely work and jam all the time. That being said, you're plucky under the command of a general named Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, because he commanded African American forces during the Spanish American War. And the last major mission he gone off was to go catch Pancho Villa. Well, unfortunately, he never caught Pancho Villa, but now he's the commander of American forces. You go to war and you get in this thing called the Argonne Offensive. And at the same time that you enter the war, the Russians drop out. Now, your troops are bright and bushy-tailed and ready to go fight, and you tend not to give up land once you take it. And so once you entered, there's one last giant push by the Germans, and when they pushed, you didn't move. And with the Spanish flu epidemic that's hitting, and the running low on supplies, and the destabilization of the German government, and the Germans just can't go any further. That one last push was enough, and they can't do anything. And so the Central Powers are going to seek peace. And so on the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, the guns fall silent on the Western Front, and that's what ended the war. And that's where we are going to end tonight. So we will finish up the war with what comes later and after the war and how we got ourselves into the next war by starting with this lovely thing called the Paris Peace Conference. So, all right, there you've got 2 lectures now. Let's see what we can do from there. Have a good night or a good day or whatever time you're watching this. So, all right, we're out of here. So, one little thing we have to correct on the video you just watched. All of us nerds are going to point out to the fact that it's not Bilbo Baggins, but it's Frodo. That Tolkien is probably the character Frodo in Lord of the Rings because Bilbo Baggins is in The Hobbit. So that is corrected now. You can stop yelling at your computer that I'm a terrible nerd and I fixed it. So there. Talk to you soon. Bye.